What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest cults. Let's begin. Certain religious movements have captured public imagination not for their spiritual teachings, but for the darkness that lurked beneath their seemingly enlightened facades. Today, we're diving deep into three organizations that shocked the world with their deadly consequences and bizarre beliefs. These aren't your typical Sunday morning congregations. These are groups where devotion turned deadly, where spiritual seeking became spiritual manipulation, and where the promise of enlightenment led to unimaginable tragedy. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about religious freedom, charismatic leadership, and the dangerous power of absolute belief. We're talking about movements that attracted thousands of followers, accumulated millions of dollars, and left behind legacies written in blood. From the drawing rooms of Victorian spiritualists to the jungles of South America, from Swiss chalets to remote communes, these organizations prove that the line between salvation and destruction can be terrifyingly thin. The first group we're examining might surprise you. While most people associate deadly cults with isolated compounds and charismatic madmen, the Theosophical Society emerged from the sophisticated salons of 19th century New York City. Founded in 1875 by a trio of intellectuals, this movement promised to unlock the hidden wisdom of the ages. But behind its scholarly facade lay a web of fraud, manipulation, and psychological control that would influence dangerous spiritual movements for generations to come. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was no ordinary spiritual seeker. This Russian aristocrat claimed to possess extraordinary psychic powers and direct communication with a secret brotherhood of spiritual masters hidden in the mountains of Tibet. Alongside Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a Civil War veteran and lawyer, and William Quan Judge, they established what would become one of the most influential esoteric organizations in Western history. Their mission sounded noble enough to form a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, or color, to study comparative religion and philosophy, and to investigate the unexplained laws of nature. But the Theosophical Society was built on a foundation of deception that would make modern con artists blush. Blavatsky claimed these Tibetan masters, whom she called Mahatmas, would materialize letters out of thin air, providing divine guidance to her followers. Witnesses described seances where furniture moved, voices spoke from empty rooms, and mysterious letters appeared as if by magic. Wealthy socialites and intellectuals flocked to these demonstrations, desperate for proof that death was not the end and that ancient wisdom could solve the problems of the modern world. The Society's teachings were a bizarre cocktail of Eastern mysticism, Western occultism, and pseudo-scientific theories that would make your head spin. They promoted the idea of root races, claiming that humanity evolved through distinct racial groups, with some being more spiritually advanced than others. This concept would later influence some of the most dangerous ideologies of the 20th century. They taught that certain individuals were more evolved souls, destined to guide humanity toward enlightenment, while others were spiritual inferiors who needed guidance from their betters. What made the Theosophical Society particularly insidious was how it wrapped its manipulation in intellectual respectability. Unlike the crude tactics of street corner prophets, Blavatsky and her associates created an elaborate mythology complete with ancient texts, complex cosmological diagrams, and a hierarchy of spiritual advancement that kept followers constantly striving for the next level of initiation. Members were taught that they were part of an elite group with access to secret knowledge hidden from ordinary humanity. The House of Cards began to collapse in 1884 when Emma Coulomb, Blavatsky's former housekeeper, revealed the mechanical devices hidden behind walls that created the supernatural phenomena. She published letters allegedly written by Blavatsky that detailed how to fake the materialization of the Mahatmas' messages. But here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of fraud, many followers refused to abandon their beliefs. They had invested too much of their identity, their money, and their social connections in the movement to simply walk away. This psychological phenomenon, known today as the sunk cost fallacy, would become a hallmark of manipulative spiritual movements. The society split into competing factions, each claiming to possess the true teachings, and these schisms often turned vicious. The Theosophical Society's influence extended far beyond its immediate membership. It popularized Eastern concepts like karma and reincarnation in Western culture, but it also legitimized the idea that spiritual truth could be monopolized by special individuals with unique access to hidden masters. This template would be copied by countless spiritual movements throughout the 20th century, many of which would prove far more deadly than their Victorian predecessor. Annie Besant, who took control of the society after Blavatsky's death, pushed the organization into even more controversial territory. She claimed to have discovered the New World Teacher, a young Indian boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti, whom she proclaimed was the reincarnation of Christ and Buddha combined. Krishnamurti was removed from his family, subjected to intensive indoctrination, and paraded before theosophical audiences as proof of the society's divine mission. The psychological damage inflicted on Krishnamurti and other young people caught up in these power games was severe. Many former members reported feeling manipulated, exploited, and spiritually abused by leaders who claimed to represent humanity's highest ideals. The society's emphasis on spiritual hierarchy created an environment where questioning authority was seen as a sign of spiritual immaturity, a dynamic that would be perfected by later cult leaders with far more deadly intentions. What makes the Theosophical Society's story particularly chilling is how it demonstrates that educated, intelligent people can be just as susceptible to manipulation as anyone else. The society attracted prominent writers, scientists, and political figures who should have known better. But the promise of secret knowledge and spiritual superiority proved irresistible to individuals who saw themselves as too sophisticated for conventional religion. The financial exploitation within the society was systematic and ruthless. Members were encouraged to donate large sums to support the work of the masters, to fund expeditions to find hidden wisdom, and to maintain the lavish lifestyle of the leadership. Blavatsky lived in luxury, while many of her followers struggled financially, having given their savings to support what they believed was humanity's spiritual evolution. Perhaps most disturbing was how the society's teachings about spiritual evolution and root races provided intellectual cover for some of the darkest ideologies of the following century. Several prominent Nazis, including Rudolf Hess, were influenced by theosophical ideas about Aryan superiority and the spiritual destiny of certain racial groups. The society's emphasis on hidden masters and secret knowledge also influenced the development of numerous conspiracy theories that continue to plague society today. The Theosophical Society may not have ended in mass suicide or murder like the other groups we'll examine, but its legacy of spiritual manipulation and intellectual fraud created the template that countless dangerous movements would follow. It proved that the most effective spiritual cons don't rely on crude threats or obvious coercion, but on the far more subtle manipulation of human desires for meaning, superiority, and secret knowledge. Even today, various theosophical organizations continue to operate around the world, still claiming access to ancient wisdom and spiritual masters. Moving from the 19th century's pseudoscientific deceptions to the 20th century's most horrifying reality, we encounter Jim Jones and his People's Temple. If the Theosophical Society showed us how intellectual manipulation could spread dangerous ideas, Jones demonstrated how charismatic authority could weaponize those very same concepts into instruments of mass death. Jim Jones didn't start as a killer. In fact, his early ministry in Indianapolis during the 1950s appeared genuinely progressive. He preached racial integration at a time when most American churches remained segregated. He opened soup kitchens, provided free medical care, and established nursing homes for the elderly. To outsiders, Jones looked like a social justice warrior ahead of his time. But beneath this humanitarian facade, Jones was already displaying the classic markers of a dangerous cult leader. He claimed divine powers, insisting he could heal the sick and raise the dead. During services, he would stage elaborate fake healings, having accomplices pretend to be cured of cancer or paralysis. He kept detailed files on congregation members, using informants to gather personal information that he would later reveal during services, convincing followers he possessed supernatural knowledge about their lives. The most chilling aspect of Jones's early manipulation was how he gradually replaced traditional Christian doctrine with his own twisted ideology. He called it apostolic socialism, blending Marxist revolutionary rhetoric with religious fervor. Jones taught that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, Buddha, and even Vladimir Lenin. He convinced followers that the Bible was a tool of oppression and that true salvation came through absolute devotion to him personally. As media scrutiny intensified in California during the 1970s, Jones made a fateful decision. He would create his own isolated paradise in the jungles of Guyana, South America. He called it Jonestown, promising followers a utopian agricultural commune where they could live free from American racism and nuclear war. What he actually created was a concentration camp disguised as a spiritual retreat. Life in Jonestown bore no resemblance to the promised paradise. Members worked 16-hour days in brutal tropical heat, surviving on rice and beans while Jones dined on imported delicacies. Armed guards prevented anyone from leaving. Jones controlled every aspect of daily life, from work assignments to sexual relationships. Children were separated from parents and subjected to horrific abuse. Jones's voice echoed constantly through loudspeakers, delivering rambling sermons that mixed political indoctrination with threats of violence. The psychological control Jones wielded over his followers defies easy explanation. He used a technique called catharsis sessions, where members were forced to confess their deepest fears and secrets in front of the entire community. These confessions would then be used to humiliate and blackmail them. Jones deliberately created an atmosphere of paranoia, claiming that CIA agents and government conspirators were constantly plotting to destroy their community. Perhaps most disturbing were the White Nights, emergency drills where Jones would wake the entire community with air raid sirens, claiming they were under attack. During these staged emergencies, armed guards would force everyone to drink what Jones claimed was poison, telling them they had only minutes to live. After terrifying moments of waiting for death, Jones would announce it was only a test of their loyalty. These rehearsals for mass suicide became increasingly frequent as Jones's mental state deteriorated. By 1978, Jones was addicted to prescription drugs and displaying clear signs of paranoid psychosis. Former members who had escaped Jonestown were speaking to the media about the horrific conditions. Concerned relatives formed a group called the Concerned Relatives, lobbying Congress to investigate. When Congressman Leo Ryan announced his intention to visit Jonestown personally, Jones knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Ryan's visit on November 17, 1978, initially proceeded peacefully. Jones put on a performance showing the congressman happy residence and productive agricultural projects. But when several members asked to leave with Ryan's delegation, the facade crumbled. Jones's paranoia exploded into homicidal rage. As Ryan's group prepared to depart from a nearby airstrip, Temple gunmen opened fire, killing Ryan, 3 journalists, and 1 defector. Unlike the previous White Nights, this would not be a drill. Jones had prepared a large vat of grape-flavored Flavor Aid mixed with cyanide, Valium, and other drugs. He called it revolutionary suicide, claiming it was their only escape from the torture and persecution that awaited them. The audio recording of those final hours reveals the full horror of Jones's manipulation. You can hear crying children in the background as Jones calmly explains why they must all die. Some followers spoke in favor of the suicide, their voices reflecting years of psychological conditioning. Others questioned the decision, asking why the children had to die. Jones's response was chilling in its calculated manipulation of parental love. He told parents that the children would suffer terribly if left behind, that death was actually an act of mercy. The process was methodical and horrifying. Medical personnel used syringes to squirt the poison into the mouths of infants and young children. Parents were forced to watch their children die before taking the poison themselves. Those who hesitated were coerced by armed guards. Some members tried to flee into the jungle, but were shot down. Within hours, 909 people lay dead, including 276 children. Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head, though whether it was suicide or murder remains unclear. The Jonestown massacre sent shockwaves around the world, fundamentally changing how society viewed religious movements. The phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," entered common usage. Though the irony is bitter, most of those who died had no choice in the matter. They were victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation, not willing participants in revolutionary suicide. Investigation revealed the full extent of Jones's deception. Temple members had been forced to sign over their Social Security checks, property deeds, and life insurance policies. Jones had accumulated millions of dollars while his followers lived in poverty. Swiss bank accounts contained funds that could have provided comfortable lives for everyone in Jonestown, but Jones preferred to maintain absolute control through deprivation. The tragedy also exposed how Jones had cultivated political connections to protect his operation. He had received endorsements from prominent politicians, including San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and future First Lady Rosalind Carter. Temple members had been bused to political rallies, creating the appearance of grassroots support in exchange for protection from investigation. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that many warning signs had been ignored. Former members had been reporting abuse for years, but their accounts were dismissed as the complaints of disgruntled ex-followers. Social workers who visited Jonestown were given carefully orchestrated tours that concealed the true conditions. The tragedy might have been prevented if authorities had taken these reports seriously. The People's Temple represents the ultimate evolution of cultic manipulation, the transformation of legitimate social concerns into weapons of psychological control. Jones exploited real issues like racism, poverty, and social injustice to create a following, then gradually replaced genuine care with absolute power. His followers weren't weak or gullible. They were people seeking meaningful community and social change who fell victim to one of history's most sophisticated predators. The legacy of Jonestown extends far beyond that terrible day in Guyana. It demonstrated how quickly idealistic movements can transform into instruments of destruction when led by individuals who prioritize personal power over human welfare. It showed how isolation, information control, and psychological manipulation can override even the strongest human instincts for survival and protection of children. Understanding the People's Temple tragedy isn't just about examining historical events. It's about recognizing patterns of manipulation that continue to appear in various forms today. From political extremist groups to online conspiracy communities, the same techniques Jones used to control his followers are being deployed by new generations of manipulators. Our third group, the Order of the Solar Temple, represents perhaps the most chilling example of how esoteric beliefs can transform into instruments of mass death. Founded in 1984 in Geneva, Switzerland, this secretive organization would orchestrate some of the most meticulously planned ritual murders in modern history, leaving investigators worldwide struggling to comprehend the depths of human manipulation and spiritual delusion. The order emerged from the collaboration of two men whose combined influence would prove catastrophically deadly. Joseph di Mambro, a French jeweler with a criminal history of fraud and embezzlement, possessed an uncanny ability to weave intricate mythologies that captivated educated, affluent followers. His partner, Luc Jouret, was a Belgian homeopathic physician whose charismatic lectures on New Age spirituality and apocalyptic prophecies drew crowds across French-speaking Europe. Together, they created a movement that would attract over 500 members, many of them successful professionals, wealthy retirees, and influential figures in Swiss and Canadian society. The order's belief system was a carefully constructed labyrinth of esoteric traditions. They claimed direct lineage to the medieval Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks who had supposedly discovered ancient secrets in the Holy Land. But this was just the foundation. Di Mambro and Jure layered on elements from Rosicrucianism with its promises of hidden alchemical knowledge, Theosophy's concept of spiritual masters, and Gnostic Christianity's emphasis on secret salvation. Transit was not metaphorical. According to the order's teachings, physical death was merely the doorway to a higher existence on Sirius, the brightest star visible from Earth. But this wasn't suicide as most understood it. The leaders taught that their deaths would be a form of cosmic graduation, a transformation that would allow them to continue their spiritual work from a higher dimensional plane. They called it death with meaning, and they convinced their followers that remaining on Earth meant facing a fate worse than death itself. The organizational structure of the Solar Temple was deliberately designed to create psychological dependency. Members progressed through ascending degrees of initiation, each level promising greater spiritual knowledge and cosmic responsibility. The inner circle, known as the International Chivalric Order Solar Tradition, was limited to 33 members who believed they were humanity's spiritual elite. These individuals paid enormous sums for their positions, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, which Di Mambro used to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle while preaching detachment from material possessions. Di Mambro's control methods were sophisticated and ruthless. He convinced members that he could communicate with ascended masters and that their spiritual progress depended entirely on his guidance. He arranged marriages, dictated career choices, and even determined which children could be born to members. Some followers were told their children were spiritually defective and needed to be transited before they could contaminate others. The psychological manipulation was so complete that parents would later willingly participate in the murder of their own children, believing they were saving their souls. Jure's role was equally crucial, but different. While Di Mambro managed the inner workings, Jure served as the public face, traveling extensively to deliver lectures that blended environmental catastrophism with spiritual urgency. He spoke eloquently about humanity's approaching extinction through ecological collapse, nuclear war, and moral decay. His medical background lent credibility to his claims about human consciousness and the possibility of existence beyond physical death. Audiences found his presentations intellectually compelling and emotionally stirring, never suspecting they were being recruited into a death cult. The first signs of the order's violent intentions emerged in 1993 when a former member named Tony Dutoit and his wife were found murdered in their Quebec home. Their 3-month-old infant had been stabbed repeatedly with a wooden stake. Investigators later learned that Di Mambro had ordered their deaths because he believed the baby was the Antichrist, sent to destroy the order's spiritual mission. This horrific crime was a preview of the systematic murders that would follow. By 1994, internal pressures were mounting within the Solar Temple. Several high-profile members had begun questioning the leader's increasingly erratic behavior and the group's financial irregularities. Swiss authorities were investigating Di Mambro's business dealings, and Canadian police were examining connections between the order and illegal weapons purchases. Facing exposure and losing control, DiMambro decided that the time for mass transit had arrived. The first wave of deaths began on September 30th, 1994, in Morin Heights, Quebec. 5 members of the order were found dead in a luxury chalet, their bodies arranged in ritualistic positions. But this was just the beginning. On October 4th and 5th, Swiss police made even more disturbing discoveries. In the village of Chéry, 23 bodies were found in a secret underground chamber beneath a renovated farmhouse. The victims had been shot, poisoned, or suffocated, then arranged in a circle with their feet pointing toward the center. Many wore ceremonial robes, and their faces were covered with plastic bags. The scene in Salvan, Switzerland, was even more elaborate. Investigators found 25 bodies in 3 ski chalets that had been rigged with sophisticated incendiary devices. Among the dead were DiMambro and Jure themselves, along with several children, including some as young as 4 years old. Forensic evidence revealed that many victims had been drugged before being shot execution style, while others appeared to have ingested poison willingly. What made these deaths particularly horrifying was their ritualistic precision. The killers had used a combination of methods, suggesting careful planning and a hierarchy of death. Some victims were clearly murdered against their will, with evidence of restraints and defensive wounds. Others seemed to have participated voluntarily, lying peacefully in ceremonial positions with no signs of struggle. Children were killed first, often by their own parents, who believed they were ensuring their offspring's spiritual salvation. The investigation revealed the depth of manipulation within the solar temple. Suicide letters left by members expressed gratitude for being chosen for transit and excitement about their cosmic journey. Some victims had spent their final days in meditation and ritual preparation, convinced they were about to experience the ultimate spiritual transformation. The psychological control was so complete that people who had lived successful, rational lives willingly participated in their own destruction and the murder of their children. But the horror didn't end in 1994. Despite the deaths of its primary leaders, the Solar Temple's influence persisted through surviving members who believed DiMambro and Jure were communicating from the spiritual realm. In December 1995, 16 more members were found dead in a remote forest in the French Alps. The bodies were arranged in a star formation, their heads pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel. Evidence suggested that some had been forced to participate, while others had embraced their fate as a reunion with their departed leaders. The final chapter occurred in March 1997, when 5 more Solar Temple members died in Quebec. This time, investigators found evidence of elaborate planning that had taken months to execute. The perpetrators had carefully studied the earlier incidents and sought to create an even more dramatic finale. 3 adults and 2 teenagers died in a house fire that consumed their bodies and most physical evidence, but not before they had recorded final messages expressing their joy at joining their cosmic family. The Solar Temple tragedies exposed disturbing truths about the vulnerability of educated, affluent individuals to sophisticated manipulation. Unlike stereotypical cult members, these victims were successful professionals, retired executives, and respected community members. They had resources, education, and social connections, yet they were systematically isolated from reality and convinced to participate in mass murder-suicide. The psychological techniques used by Di Mambro and Jure were masterful in their cruelty. They created artificial scarcity by limiting membership to an elite few, making followers feel specially chosen. They mixed legitimate spiritual concepts with fabricated revelations, making it difficult for members to distinguish truth from manipulation. They gradually normalized the concept of death as transition, starting with abstract discussions and slowly moving toward concrete planning. Most importantly, they created a closed information system where questioning the leaders was seen as spiritual failure. The impact of the Solar Temple massacres extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families were shattered as they struggled to understand how their loved ones could have been deceived so completely. The tragedies sparked intense debate about religious freedom versus public safety, leading several countries to strengthen their monitoring of potentially dangerous groups. The French government established Miviludes, an organization dedicated to tracking sectarian movements, while other nations developed similar oversight mechanisms. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the Solar Temple's appeal wasn't based on poverty, social isolation, or mental illness, the factors typically associated with cult recruitment. Instead, it attracted people seeking meaning and transcendence in an increasingly materialistic world. The victims were searching for something deeper than conventional religion could provide, and they found leaders who promised cosmic significance and spiritual adventure. The Solar Temple stands as a chilling reminder that the deadliest cults are often those that appear most sophisticated and intellectually appealing. Unlike crude doomsday groups that attract society's marginalized, the Solar Temple recruited from the educated elite by offering a compelling narrative about humanity's spiritual evolution and their role as cosmic pioneers. These three organizations, the Theosophical Society, the People's Temple, and the Order of the Solar Temple, represent different faces of the same fundamental danger: the human susceptibility to authoritarian manipulation disguised as spiritual enlightenment. Each group began with appealing ideals and charismatic leadership, but gradually transformed into instruments of control, exploitation, and ultimately, in two cases, mass death. The patterns are unmistakable across all three movements. Charismatic leaders who claimed special spiritual authority, gradual isolation of members from outside influences, the creation of elite inner circles with access to secret knowledge, financial exploitation disguised as spiritual contribution, the normalization of increasingly extreme beliefs and behaviors, and ultimately, the willingness to sacrifice human life for abstract ideological goals. What makes these stories particularly relevant today is how they illuminate the ongoing vulnerability of individuals seeking meaning and community in an increasingly fragmented world. What makes these three organizations particularly chilling is how they reveal the devastating power of intellectual manipulation combined with spiritual authority. Each group demonstrates a different pathway to destruction, yet all three share common threads that allowed them to ensnare intelligent, educated individuals who genuinely believed they were part of something profound and meaningful. The psychological warfare employed by these groups was sophisticated beyond what most people imagine. They didn't simply prey on the desperate or uneducated. Instead, They created elaborate systems of belief that appealed to humanity's deepest desires for purpose, transcendence, and belonging. The Theosophical Society attracted intellectuals and spiritual seekers with promises of ancient wisdom and universal brotherhood. The People's Temple drew social justice advocates with visions of racial equality and utopian community. The Order of the Solar Temple recruited successful professionals with esoteric knowledge and promises of spiritual evolution. But beneath these noble facades lay calculated systems of control that would make modern psychologists shudder. Take the concept of progressive revelation used by all three groups. Members weren't immediately exposed to the most extreme beliefs or practices. Instead, they were gradually introduced to increasingly radical ideas through carefully structured initiation processes. The Theosophical Society had its degrees of membership, each revealing supposedly deeper truths. Jim Jones slowly transformed from a civil rights advocate to a paranoid dictator demanding absolute submission. The Solar Temple used elaborate rituals and ascending levels of knowledge to draw members deeper into their web. The financial exploitation across all three groups reveals another disturbing pattern. These weren't simply spiritual movements gone wrong. They were sophisticated economic operations disguised as religious organizations. Helena Blavatsky lived comfortably off donations while claiming poverty and spiritual detachment. Jim Jones accumulated millions of dollars while his followers lived in poverty, ultimately forcing them to sign over Social Security checks, property deeds, and life insurance policies. The Solar Temple specifically targeted wealthy individuals, with some members contributing hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund the group's activities and the leaders' lavish lifestyles. Perhaps most disturbing is how these groups weaponized genuine human needs against their followers. The need for community became isolation from outside support systems. The desire for spiritual growth became submission to increasingly bizarre and harmful practices. The search for meaning became participation in activities that violated members' original moral frameworks. This psychological alchemy transformed virtues into vulnerabilities, making escape increasingly difficult as members became more invested in the group's worldview. The role of secrecy cannot be overstated in understanding how these groups maintained control. All three organizations created inner circles of knowledge, making members feel special and chosen while simultaneously binding them to silence. The Theosophical Society claimed access to hidden masters and ancient wisdom unavailable to outsiders. The People's Temple developed an elaborate system of informants and public confessions that made trust impossible. The Solar Temple used ritual secrecy and esoteric symbolism to create a sense of exclusive access to cosmic truths. What's particularly chilling about the Solar Temple is how it demonstrates that education and professional success provide no immunity against sophisticated manipulation. Among the victims were doctors, lawyers, executives, and civil servants. These were individuals accustomed to analyzing complex information and making rational decisions. Yet they were convinced to participate in their own deaths and the murders of their children based on beliefs about spiritual transit to distant stars. The children in these groups deserve special attention because their stories reveal the ultimate moral bankruptcy of these organizations. The Theosophical Society promoted racial hierarchies that justified treating certain children as inherently superior or inferior. The People's Temple subjected children to brutal punishments, forced separations from parents, and ultimately murder disguised as revolutionary suicide. The Solar Temple included children in their ritual killings, with adults who claimed to love these children, nonetheless administering fatal doses of poison or inflicting fatal injuries. The aftermath of these groups continues to ripple through society today. The Theosophical Society's racial theories influenced numerous other movements and contributed to pseudoscientific justifications for discrimination. Survivors of the People's Temple struggle with trauma, guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding lives after losing entire communities. The Solar Temple incidents led to increased scrutiny of new religious movements across Europe and North America, fundamentally changing how authorities approach potentially dangerous groups. But perhaps the most important lesson from these three organizations is how they exploited the gap between human aspirations and human reality. People genuinely want to believe in something greater than themselves. They want to be part of communities that matter. They want their lives to have cosmic significance. These are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are fundamental human needs that deserve respect and fulfillment. The tragedy is that these groups took those noble desires and perverted them into instruments of control, exploitation, and ultimately destruction. They promised enlightenment but delivered ignorance. They promised community but created isolation. They promised transcendence but brought only death and suffering. Understanding these groups requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social dynamics. We want to believe that we would never fall for such obvious manipulation, but the evidence suggests otherwise. These groups succeeded precisely because they didn't appear obviously dangerous. They attracted thoughtful, caring individuals who wanted to make the world better. The warning signs were there, but they were subtle and often disguised as virtues. Excessive reverence for leadership became devotion. Questioning doctrine became disloyalty. Financial sacrifice became spiritual purification. Isolation from critics became protection from negative influences. By the time members recognized these patterns, they were often too psychologically and practically invested to easily escape. These three groups represent different faces of the same fundamental threat: the corruption of legitimate spiritual and social impulses by individuals willing to exploit human vulnerability for personal gain. They remind us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against obvious external threats, but against the subtle internal processes that can transform seekers into victims and victims into perpetrators. Their legacy challenges us to create healthier communities and spiritual practices that fulfill genuine human needs without demanding the surrender of critical thinking, personal autonomy, or moral responsibility. The psychological mechanisms that make these organizations so devastatingly effective share disturbing parallels that reveal the dark architecture of human manipulation. When we examine the Theosophical Society, the People's Temple, and the Order of the Solar Temple side by side, we discover a terrifying blueprint for how sincere spiritual seeking can be weaponized against the very people it promises to liberate. The foundation of all three groups rested on what psychologists call transcendent promises, grand visions that addressed humanity's deepest longings. The Theosophical Society offered ancient wisdom and spiritual evolution, promising members they could become part of an elite brotherhood guided by enlightened masters. The People's Temple pledged racial equality and socialist utopia in a world torn by injustice. The Order of the Solar Temple promised cosmic transcendence and escape from an apocalyptic world through spiritual transit to higher dimensions. These weren't mere religious beliefs. They were carefully crafted psychological lures that exploited our fundamental human need for meaning, purpose, and belonging. But here's where the manipulation becomes truly sinister. Each organization employed what researchers call progressive commitment escalation, a process where members were gradually drawn deeper into increasingly extreme beliefs and behaviors. In the Theosophical Society, newcomers were initially exposed to relatively benign philosophical discussions about universal brotherhood and comparative religion. Only after months or years of involvement were they introduced to the more esoteric claims about hidden masters, racial hierarchies, and secret evolutionary doctrines. By then, they had already invested significant time, energy, and social connections in the movement, making it psychologically difficult to question or leave. Jim Jones perfected this technique with chilling effectiveness. New members of the People's Temple were initially attracted to genuine social work. The group ran soup kitchens, provided housing for the elderly, and actively fought racial discrimination. Jones appeared to be a progressive minister doing real good in the world, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the demands increased. Members were asked to donate more time, then more money, then to move closer to other members, then to cut ties with outside family and friends who didn't understand their mission. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, but collectively they created a web of dependence and isolation that became nearly impossible to escape. The Order of the Solar Temple employed similar tactics with their wealthy, educated membership. Initial meetings focused on historical discussions about the Knights Templar and philosophical explorations of ancient wisdom traditions. Members enjoyed the intellectual stimulation and the sense of being part of an exclusive, enlightened group. Only gradually were they introduced to the more extreme beliefs about planetary destruction and the necessity of death as spiritual transit. By the time these ideas were presented, members had already restructured their lives around the group, often donating substantial assets and severing relationships with skeptical family members. What makes these progressive commitment strategies so effective is that they exploit a fundamental quirk of human psychology called cognitive dissonance. When people invest significant time, energy, or resources in something, they experience psychological discomfort if they encounter information suggesting their investment was misguided. Rather than acknowledge the mistake and lose their investment, people tend to rationalize away contradictory evidence and become even more committed to their original choice. This explains why highly intelligent, successful individuals, including doctors, lawyers, and business executives, remained devoted to these groups even when presented with clear evidence of fraud or abuse. The role of charismatic authority cannot be overstated in understanding how these organizations maintained control. Helena Blavatsky, Jim Jones, and Joseph Di Mambro all possess the rare and dangerous combination of personal magnetism, intellectual cunning, and complete moral flexibility. They understood intuitively how to read people's deepest needs and vulnerabilities, then position themselves as the unique solution to those needs. Blavatsky claimed direct communication with spiritual masters who had chosen her as their earthly representative. Jones presented himself as both a divine figure capable of healing and prophecy, and a revolutionary leader fighting for social justice. Di Mambro and Luc Jouret positioned themselves as enlightened guides who alone possess the knowledge necessary for spiritual survival in the coming apocalypse. These leaders also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social influence. They created environments where dissent became virtually impossible through a combination of peer pressure, information control, and psychological manipulation. In all three organizations, members were encouraged to report on each other's doubts or criticisms, creating a climate of surveillance and mutual policing. Independent thinking was reframed as spiritual weakness, intellectual pride, or susceptibility to dark forces. Members learned to suppress their own doubts and questions, often unconsciously, to maintain their standing in the group and avoid social ostracism. The information control employed by these groups was particularly insidious. The Theosophical Society claimed that certain truths were too advanced for unprepared minds, creating a hierarchical system where higher-level teachings were reserved for the most committed members. This not only controlled access to potentially contradictory information, but also created a powerful incentive for deeper involvement. Members were constantly striving to prove themselves worthy of more advanced knowledge. Jim Jones used similar tactics, claiming that outside media and government agencies were engaged in a conspiracy against the temple, making any critical information suspect. He also controlled members' daily schedules so completely that they had little time or energy for independent research or reflection. The Order of the Solar Temple operated through a complex system of front organizations and secret initiations, ensuring that members never had access to the complete picture of the group's beliefs or activities. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It prevented members from fully understanding the extent of the organization's extremism until they were deeply committed, and it made it difficult for any individual member to expose the group's true nature to outsiders. Perhaps most disturbing is how these organizations exploited genuine spiritual experiences and legitimate psychological phenomena for manipulative purposes. All three groups utilized meditation, ritual, and other practices that can indeed produce altered states of consciousness and profound subjective experiences. However, these authentic experiences were then interpreted through the group's ideological framework, convincing members that their spiritual insights validated the organization's teachings and the leader's authority. Members often reported genuine feelings of transcendence, unity, and enlightenment during group activities, experiences that seemed to confirm the truth of what they were being taught, even when the teachings themselves were based on deception and manipulation. The tragic irony is that the very sincerity of the spiritual seeking that drew people to these groups became the weapon used against them. Their genuine desire for truth, meaning, and transcendence was carefully channeled into systems of belief and behavior that ultimately served only to enrich and empower the leaders while devastating the lives of the followers. The more sincere and committed the seeker, the more vulnerable they became to manipulation, because their spiritual dedication prevented them from maintaining the healthy skepticism that might have protected them. Understanding these psychological mechanisms is crucial because they continue to operate in various forms throughout our society. The same techniques that enabled the Theosophical Society to influence Western spiritual thought, that allowed Jim Jones to lead nearly 1,000 people to their deaths, and that convinced educated professionals to participate in ritual murder-suicide with the Order of the Solar Temple, are still being employed by manipulative leaders and organizations today. They appear in political movements, business organizations, self-help groups, and spiritual communities of all kinds. The defense against such manipulation begins with understanding its mechanisms, but it requires more than intellectual knowledge. It demands cultivating the psychological and spiritual maturity to hold our deepest longings lightly enough that they cannot be easily exploited. It means learning to distinguish between authentic spiritual authority and charismatic manipulation, between genuine community and cultic control, between healthy commitment and dangerous fanaticism. The devastating patterns we've explored reveal how easily sophisticated manipulation can override our most basic survival instincts. The mass deaths at Jonestown and within the Order of the Solar Temple weren't sudden explosions of violence, but the inevitable culmination of years of systematic psychological conditioning. Understanding how these groups achieve such complete control over their members requires examining the final stages of their deadly evolution. In Jonestown, the process that led to the deaths of over 900 people began with what Jim Jones called White Nights, practice sessions for revolutionary suicide that occurred dozens of times before the final tragedy. During these rehearsals, members would be awakened in the middle of the night by armed guards and told that government forces were about to attack the compound. They would then be given cups of liquid and told it contained poison, that they were about to die for their cause. After drinking, they would wait in terror for death, only to be told hours later that it had been a loyalty test. This psychological torture served multiple purposes. It desensitized members to the idea of mass suicide. It identified potential resistors who could be dealt with separately, and it created a trauma bond where members felt grateful to Jones for allowing them to live. The effectiveness of these rehearsals became horrifically clear on November 18, 1978. When Jones announced the final White Night, many members initially assumed it was another drill. The audio recordings from that day reveal the confusion and gradual realization that this time was different. What's particularly chilling is how normal the beginning sounds. Jones speaks, in his typical rambling style, about persecution and revolutionary suicide, while children can be heard playing in the background. The transition from a community meeting to mass murder happens with shocking mundanity. The Order of the Solar Temple employed different but equally effective methods of psychological preparation. Unlike the People's Temple's dramatic rehearsals, the Solar Temple used what they called progressive revelation, gradually introducing members to increasingly extreme concepts. New members might initially be told they were part of a philosophical study group focused on ancient wisdom. Over months or years, they would be exposed to increasingly esoteric beliefs about their special destiny and the necessity of leaving their physical bodies to achieve spiritual evolution. Dimambro and Jouret created elaborate theatrical productions to convince members of their supernatural powers. They used hidden speakers, stage magic, and confederates to create miracles during ceremonies. Members reported seeing apparitions of ascended masters, hearing voices from beyond, and witnessing objects materialize from thin air. These manufactured spiritual experiences created powerful emotional bonds and made members feel they were part of something genuinely transcendent. When the time came for the transits, many members genuinely believed they were embarking on a spiritual journey to Sirius rather than committing suicide. The financial exploitation in both groups reached staggering levels. The People's Temple accumulated an estimated $15 million from member donations, property transfers, and government benefit fraud. Members signed over their homes, life insurance policies, social security checks, and wages. In return, they received minimal food, crowded housing, and the promise of social justice. The Solar Temple's financial operations were even more sophisticated, involving multiple corporations, offshore accounts, and complex real estate transactions. Members paid enormous fees for advancing through spiritual levels, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the privilege of receiving higher teachings. Both groups used children as instruments of control in particularly disturbing ways. In Jonestown, children were separated from their parents and raised communally, creating multiple parent-child relationships that made escape psychologically impossible for adults. Parents couldn't bear to leave their children, and the communal child-rearing meant that leaving would mean abandoning not just their own children, but all the children they had helped raise. The Solar Temple used a different approach, convincing parents that their children were special spiritual beings who had chosen to incarnate within the group. When the time came for the transits, parents believed they were helping their children complete their spiritual missions. The medical and pharmaceutical aspects of control in both groups were extensive. Jim Jones was addicted to multiple drugs and likely suffered from serious mental illness in his final years, but he also used drugs systematically to control his followers. Members were given stimulants to work longer hours and sedatives to sleep less. Elderly members were often overmedicated to keep them compliant. The Solar Temple used homeopathic medicine as both a recruitment tool and a method of control, with Jouret's medical background lending credibility to his spiritual claims. The technology of surveillance and control employed by these groups was remarkably advanced for their time. Jonestown had a sophisticated radio network that monitored communications and tracked the movements of members and outsiders. The compound was surrounded by armed guards, and escape routes through the jungle were nearly impossible. The Solar Temple used more subtle forms of surveillance, including financial monitoring and the requirement for members to confess their deepest secrets and fears during spiritual counseling sessions. This information was then used to manipulate and control them. Perhaps most chilling is how both groups normalized violence and death through gradual escalation. The People's Temple began with minor punishments and public humiliations, gradually escalating to severe beatings, forced labor, and isolation. By the time members witnessed or experienced serious violence, they had already been conditioned to accept it as necessary for their spiritual or political development. The Solar Temple used ritual symbolism and esoteric teachings about death and rebirth to make violence seem mystical and transformative rather than destructive. The aftermath of these tragedies reveals the lasting impact on survivors and families. The few survivors of Jonestown struggled with survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives after losing everything. Many had signed over their assets and had no resources to start over. Children who survived faced the additional trauma of having lost parents and siblings in circumstances that were difficult to explain or understand. The Solar Temple survivors faced similar challenges, with the added burden of having been associated with a group that the media portrayed as wealthy, educated people who should have known better. These cases fundamentally changed how law enforcement and mental health professionals approach dangerous groups. The scale of the tragedies forced authorities to take seriously the potential for mass violence within religious movements, leading to new protocols for investigation and intervention. However, this increased scrutiny also created challenges for legitimate religious minorities who found themselves subject to suspicion and monitoring. The global impact of these events extended far beyond their immediate victims. The Jonestown Massacre introduced the phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" into common usage, trivializing one of the most horrific mass murders in American history. The Solar Temple incidents contributed to anti-cult legislation in several European countries and influenced international discussions about religious freedom versus public safety. What makes these stories particularly relevant today is how the same psychological techniques are being employed by various groups and movements, not all of them religious. The methods of gradual commitment escalation, isolation from outside influences, financial exploitation, and the creation of our us versus them mentalities can be found in political extremist groups, online communities, and even some business organizations. The digital age has made these techniques more accessible and potentially more dangerous, as online echo chambers can accelerate radicalization processes that once took years to develop. The stories of the Theosophical Society, People's Temple, and Order of the Solar Temple serve as warnings about the human capacity for both transcendence and self-destruction. They remind us that intelligence, education, and good intentions are not sufficient protection against sophisticated manipulation. They show us that the desire for meaning, community, and spiritual growth, our most noble human aspirations, can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit our deepest needs and fears. Understanding these patterns is not about becoming cynical or suspicious of all spiritual or communal endeavors. Instead, it's about developing the psychological sophistication to recognize healthy versus unhealthy group dynamics, to maintain critical thinking even in the face of charismatic leadership, and to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. The psychological mechanisms these organizations employed to maintain control over their members reveal disturbing patterns that extend far beyond their immediate victims. Understanding these methods becomes crucial for recognizing similar manipulation tactics in contemporary society. The power of graduated commitment cannot be overstated in examining how these groups ensnared their followers. Each organization began with seemingly reasonable requests that progressively escalated into total surrender of autonomy. The Theosophical Society initially attracted members through intellectual curiosity about ancient wisdom and spiritual truths, gradually drawing them into deeper levels of esoteric knowledge that required increasing devotion and financial commitment to the organization's hierarchy. Members found themselves investing years of study and substantial resources before realizing the extent of their psychological entanglement. Jim Jones perfected this technique with devastating effectiveness. New members of the People's Temple were initially asked to attend services and participate in community outreach programs that aligned with their social justice values. Slowly, Jones introduced mandatory work assignments, then requests for financial donations, followed by demands to surrender personal property and eventually complete control over members' living arrangements, relationships, and daily schedules. By the time followers recognized the manipulation, they had already sacrificed too much to easily walk away, a psychological trap known as the sunk cost fallacy. The Order of the Solar Temple employed particularly sophisticated psychological manipulation through its hierarchical initiation system. New recruits began with basic philosophical discussions about spirituality and personal growth. As they progressed through increasingly exclusive levels of membership, they were gradually exposed to more extreme beliefs about apocalyptic transformation and the necessity of spiritual transit through death. The exclusive nature of advanced knowledge made members feel specially chosen while simultaneously isolating them from outside perspectives that might challenge the group's increasingly dangerous ideology. These organizations also exploited fundamental human needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence with calculated precision. The Theosophical Society attracted individuals seeking deeper spiritual understanding during an era of rapid scientific advancement that challenged traditional religious beliefs. Helena Blavatsky and her successors positioned themselves as bridges between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, offering followers a sense of being part of an enlightened elite with access to hidden truths about the universe. Jim Jones weaponized the legitimate desire for racial equality and social justice to attract followers, particularly within the African American community facing systemic discrimination. The People's Temple provided a rare interracial religious community where members experienced genuine acceptance and purpose through social service work. Jones's early miracles and healings, though later revealed as elaborate frauds, gave followers hope during desperate circumstances. This authentic sense of community and purpose made it psychologically devastating for members to confront evidence of Jones's deception and abuse. The Solar Temple leaders capitalized on their followers' existential anxieties about modern life's meaninglessness and environmental destruction. They offered an exclusive path to spiritual evolution that promised escape from earthly suffering through transformation on a higher plane of existence. For affluent members feeling spiritually empty despite material success, the group's promise of ultimate meaning through cosmic consciousness proved irresistible. The isolation techniques employed by these groups systematically severed members' connections to external reality and support systems. The Theosophical Society encouraged members to view non-believers as spiritually inferior beings, incapable of understanding advanced truths. This created an us versus them mentality that made it difficult for followers to maintain relationships with family and friends who questioned their involvement. Jim Jones took isolation to extreme levels, relocating his entire community to the remote jungles of Guyana, where members had no access to outside information or communication. Even before the move to Jonestown, Jones had convinced followers that the outside world was filled with enemies plotting their destruction, making the community's physical and psychological isolation seem necessary for survival. He controlled all media consumption, replacing news and entertainment with endless recordings of his own sermons that reinforced his paranoid worldview. The Solar Temple's isolation was more subtle but equally effective. Members were taught that they possessed special knowledge that ordinary people could never comprehend. This sense of spiritual superiority made it difficult to maintain meaningful relationships outside the group, while the organization's secretive nature prevented members from discussing their beliefs and experiences with potential critics. Financial exploitation served multiple purposes beyond simple enrichment of the leaders. By demanding significant financial commitments, these groups created powerful psychological bonds through the principle of cognitive dissonance. When people invest heavily in something, they unconsciously inflate its value to justify their sacrifice. The Theosophical Society required substantial fees for advanced teachings and initiations, making members feel they were purchasing invaluable spiritual knowledge. Members who had spent thousands of dollars and years of their lives pursuing these teachings found it psychologically difficult to admit they had been deceived. The People's Temple's financial exploitation was total and devastating. Members were required to surrender their homes, savings, paychecks, and even government benefits to the organization. This created complete economic dependence that made leaving practically impossible, especially for elderly members who had transferred their life savings and Social Security checks to Jones. The financial control also served to demonstrate total submission to Jones's authority, reinforcing his psychological dominance over every aspect of members' lives. The Solar Temple's financial demands were particularly insidious because they targeted wealthy individuals who could afford substantial contributions without immediately experiencing hardship. Members paid tens of thousands of dollars for exclusive teachings and ceremonial objects, creating significant sunk costs that made departure psychologically difficult. The group's leaders also engaged in sophisticated financial fraud, using members' investments in fake business ventures to fund their lavish lifestyles while convincing followers they were supporting important spiritual work. The manipulation of children within these organizations represents perhaps their most heinous aspect. All three groups systematically indoctrinated young people who had no choice in their involvement and no ability to recognize the manipulation they experienced. The Theosophical Society promoted educational philosophies that isolated children from mainstream society while filling their minds with esoteric beliefs presented as absolute truth. Children raised in theosophical communities often struggled to integrate into normal society as adults, having been deprived of conventional education and social development. The abuse of children in the People's Temple was systematic and brutal. Jones separated children from their parents, housed them in dormitories where they received inadequate food and education, and subjected them to severe physical and psychological punishment for minor infractions. He used children as leverage to control their parents, threatening harm to kids if adults showed any signs of disloyalty. The 276 children who died at Jonestown had no choice in their fate, murdered by adults who had been conditioned to view mass suicide as a noble act of revolutionary defiance. The Solar Temple's treatment of children was equally disturbing, with several young victims found among the dead in the group's murder-suicide events. These children were viewed as obstacles to their parents' spiritual evolution, sacrificed in rituals that leaders claimed would transport them to higher planes of existence. The willingness of parents to kill their own children demonstrates the complete psychological domination these leaders achieved over their followers' most basic human instincts. The warning signs exhibited by these organizations remain relevant today as new movements continue to emerge with similar characteristics. Charismatic leadership that demands unquestioning obedience, progressive isolation from outside influences, financial exploitation, claims of exclusive access to truth or salvation, and the gradual normalization of extreme beliefs all serve as red flags for potentially dangerous groups. Modern technology has created new opportunities for manipulation that these historical groups could never have imagined. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that reinforce extremist beliefs, while online communities can provide the same sense of belonging and purpose that drew people to these organizations. The basic human vulnerabilities these groups exploited remain unchanged, making understanding their tactics more important than ever. The legacy of the Theosophical Society, People's Temple, and Order of the Solar Temple serves as a stark reminder that intelligence, education, and good intentions provide no immunity against sophisticated psychological manipulation. The hundreds of victims of these organizations were not weak-minded or gullible individuals, but people seeking meaning, community, and transcendence who fell prey to leaders who weaponized their deepest human needs against them. Their stories underscore the vital importance of critical thinking, maintaining diverse social connections, and remaining vigilant against those who claim exclusive access to truth while demanding total surrender of personal autonomy. In a world where isolation, anxiety, and the search for meaning continue to make people vulnerable to manipulation, understanding how these tragic organizations operated becomes not just a matter of historical interest, but a crucial defense against similar threats that continue to emerge in new forms today. The ultimate lesson from these dark chapters in history is that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against those who would exploit our deepest human needs for their own destructive purposes. Only by understanding how these organizations succeeded in their manipulation can we hope to prevent future tragedies and protect vulnerable individuals from falling victim to similar predators who continue to emerge in our modern world.